Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about culture-bound syndromes. We'll start talking about this today. This is part of the title for the class. It's actually one of the lectures I want to make sure to get through. And we're going to talk about what are culture-bound syndromes and what are some of these, and where do we find these as well. So first of all, we need to have a definition of culture. And there's a couple definitions here coming from the dictionary. Say the totality of socially transmitted behavior patterns, arts, beliefs, institutions, and all other products of human work and thought. Patterns, traits, products considered as an expression of a particular period, class, community, or population. The example would be Edwardian culture, Japanese culture, the culture of poverty. C would be patterns, traits, products considered with respect to a particular category, such as a field, subject, or mode of expression, religious culture in the Middle Ages, musical culture, oral culture, etc. as examples. And D would be the predominating attitudes and behaviors that characterize the functioning of a group or an organization. I used to work for Hewlett-Packard, and people used to always talk about the culture of Hewlett-Packard. Hewlett-Packard had a certain work culture that was different from a lot of other places. We can talk about 3 levels of culture. Okay, we can talk about artifacts. These are structures and processes that are sort of hard to decipher, but these can be, things or structures or how things are organized. So you think about the culture of CI. You think about the organization of sort of how you park here, right? That would be an artifact, right? Structure. You come in, you see all the cars and all the spaces are filled up. How you park and be part of that. And then we have the espoused values, strategies, goals, philosophies. And then we have basic underlying assumptions. Unconscious, taken for granted beliefs, perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, the ultimate sources of values or actions. And these things all relate to one another. So this is the unconscious stuff sort of percolating up to the conscious, to the visual stuff that you actually see and experience, sort of tactily down through sort of like back to the unconscious. And these kind of things feed back on each other. So, what are culture-bound syndromes? Well, the DSM-4, and I don't know if this is still in the 5 or not, but I'll just go with what's in the 4, define them as recurrent locality-specific patterns of aberrant behavior and troubling experience that may or may not be linked to a particular DSM diagnostic category. Many of these patterns are indigenously considered to be illnesses or at least afflictions, and most have local names. Culture-bound syndromes are generally limited to specific societies or culture areas and are localized folk diagnostic categories that frame coherent meanings for certain repetitive pattern and troubling sets of experiences and observations. And you find culture-bound syndromes referred to in the DSM under anxiety disorders, eating disorders, depressive episodes, dissociative disorders, impulse control disorders, somatoform disorders, and I believe now also maybe even personality disorders. By the way, I don't completely agree with this statement anymore. I'm going to talk a little bit where I see some different things, especially about the localization. Because I think after teaching this class and studying culture-bound syndromes for years and years and years now, what I'm seeing is that while certain aspects of a culture-bound syndrome can be localized, well, you actually can see the same syndrome in many, many different places, just expressing itself a little bit differently. And I'm going to talk about a big example of this later on. Now, at least 7 broad categories can be differentiated among phenomenon, often described as culture-bound syndromes. We can see these as apparent psychiatric illnesses, not attributable to an identified organic cause, which is locally recognized as an illness, which does not correspond to a recognized Western disease category. An example of this would be amok, which is found in Southeast Asia. I'll talk more about that. Number 2 could be an apparent psychiatric illness, not attributable to identifiable organic cause, which is recognized as an illness, and which resembles a Western disease category, but which has locally salient features different from the Western disease, and which may be lacking some symptoms seen as salient in the West. And an example of this may be what's called Xinjiang Shizhou, or neurasthenia in China, which resembles a major depressive disorder, but has more salient somatic features and often lacks the depressed mood, which defines depression in the West. Another is Taijin Kyofu, which is a Japanese form of social phobia, but it seems a lot like social isolation that we find in the Western world. Now, I will make a case, and what I'm going to make a case to you, is that I think I'm less and less thinking that number one is very common. I think the number one things are actually a lot less common than I previously thought. And for instance, I give you the example of a muck here. I actually see a muck as number two. I'm going to talk about this. That there actually are, I've seen more and more kinds of versions of this in the West, but they have different salient features. And muck is very interesting in this way. So I'm going to later on, I'm going to compare a muck to school shooters. Okay? And you can see that you know, they may be, I'll make a case that they may be similar to one another. So one is something that I think is more and more, you know, I think a lot of the stuff I used to think of as in one actually is in two. Now three, a discrete disease entity not yet recognized by Western medicine. The most famous example of this is Kuru, a progressive psychosis of dementia indigenous to cannibalistic tribes in New Guinea. We really found out that Kuru, and I'm going to talk about Kuru in detail later on, Kuru is really a prion disease. It actually has a physical cause. I'm going to talk about this in detail, so I'm not going to go into detail about it now. Kuru, not Koro. I'm going to talk different. Kuru with a U, Koro with an O. Different. 4, an illness that may or may not have a cause, may not correspond to a subset of Western disease category, or may elaborate symptoms not recognized as constituting Western disease into an illness category. In other words, it's a phenomenon which occurs in many cultural settings, which is only elaborated as an illness in one or a few. And this is Koro with an O. Okay? Koro is the fear of retracting genitalia. 5, culturally accepted explanatory mechanisms or idioms of illness which do not match allopathic medicine mechanisms or Western idioms in which a Western setting might indicate culturally inappropriate thinking and perhaps delusions and hallucinations. And examples of this include witchcraft, root work in the Caribbean, or the evil eye in the Mediterranean and Latin America. And I have a whole lecture on the evil eye just by itself. If I have time, I'd love to talk to you guys about it. It's fascinating. Did I talk to you guys about that already?
Somewhat.
A little bit. I mentioned the evil eye already, so we're not going to talk about that anymore. Okay, 6, a state or set of behaviors including trance or possession states, hearing, seeing, or communicating with dead or spirits, and feeling that one has lost one's soul from grief or fright, which may or may not be seen as pathological within a native cultural framework, but which, if not recognized as culturally appropriate, could indicate psychosis, delusions, or hallucinations in a Western setting. And those of you taking my 344 class, I'll talk a lot about shamanism. And this overlaps with some of the practices of shamanism. And 7, a syndrome allegedly occurring in a given cultural setting which does not in fact exist, but which may be reported to the anthropologist or psychiatrist. An example of this is Wendigo, which I'll talk about. I had a friend of mine who was a Native American, and the joke was that they would try to come up, when she grew up on a reservation, she said there were anthropologists there all the time studying them, and the joke among them was to try to come up with weird things to tell the anthropologist, you know, just to mess with them. And so that's number 7. And Wendigo may be one of these. Okay. So common culture-bound syndrome, there's a lot more than these. This is just sort of the greatest hits, and we can think of a lot more. We just don't have time to talk about them. Amok, found mostly in Southeast Asia and Malaysia, and through the Philippines. Arctic hysteria, or pill-blocked. Ataque de nervios, nervous breakdown, found in Latin America. Brain fag, a fag, not the pejorative term for gay people, but fag being short for fatigue. Kuro, I mentioned. Mal de ojo, evil eye. Or if you're Italian, malocchio. And if you're from Turkey, you would use the marsala to ward it off. It's a little round thing. And Wendigo, Native Americans. And there's many, many, many more. These are just the greatest hits. And we're going to talk about some other ones too. So let's talk about amok. Amok is one of the most interesting ones. It's a shortened form of the Malaysian word pingamuk. The person who suffers from amok withdraws from family and friends and then has a sudden murderous rage. And they will suddenly attack people around them at random, usually with a knife. Some sort of weapon, usually a knife. Why a knife? Because knives are available. Okay? This is important. It's important later on. Knives are available. What are not available in most Southeast Asian countries? Guns are not easily available. Okay? The person running amok, and we have this word in the English language now, running amok, does not stop until they're overpowered or killed. If they're stopped before they're killed, they'll fall into a stupor or sleep, and sometimes they have no memory of the attack on waking. Wow. It's usually a male. There's only been one recorded case of a female. The male is usually 20 to 45 years old. And there may be a female version of amok, which is really quite different, called lata, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And people have speculated that amok may be related to dissociative disorders, depression, low self-esteem, and shame. And I would say, to some degree, some of these things play a role. Okay? The likelihood of deep shame due to some sort of dishonor, and many times the inability to pay gambling debts. And so what we might have here is a loss of esteem, sudden self-esteem, a loss of status in society, and this may be a way of committing suicide. And in committing suicide, also reestablishing their self-esteem. And that for some human beings, that having a lot of self-esteem, having good thoughts about yourself is actually more important than your own life. And I'll give you some other examples of this. And that by doing this, running amok, even though you're killed, you go out as a man who's feared and respected. Everybody knows who you are. Okay? And that may be more important than living. And I'll talk about some other versions of this. Yes, you had a question?
Oh, if I know, like, I knew someone who kind of did something like this, but does this ever happen when somebody's on drugs, or is that just
no? This will be separate.
Different?
For now, just keep this separate than drugs. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because people like I went to a training with the San Francisco Police Department, and they were talking about drug users, and they were talking about the guys who took angel dust, PCP.
This one was with men.
And with people on PCP, it'll be very similar to running amok. They'll just go crazy and they become very strong as well. Cops do not like dealing with people on PCP. Now, I'm not excusing the Rodney King case, but one of the reasons why, I'm not excusing the bad behavior, but one of the reasons why they might have had such a strong response to Rodney King is they might have thought he was on PCP. They do not like having to deal with people on PCP. A lot of cops get injured. And they told me this case where this guy, I think I don't know if I mentioned this to you guys, this guy was high on PCP and they were chasing him on the freeway, he was doing 100 miles on his motorcycle, and he decided he could stop like the Flintstones, put his feet out in the ground.
Oh, yeah,
and by the time they stopped him, he was still fighting them, even though his feet were like hamburger, right? So they really don't like people on PCP, right? So we'll put those people on drugs, PCP, put them aside now for a second, okay? Not counting them in the muck. Now, here's a description. This comes from 1911. A melee will suddenly and apparently without reason rush into the street armed with a kris, which is a curvy knife, or other weapons, and slash and cut at everybody he meets until he is killed. These frenzies were formerly regarded as due to sudden insanity. It is now, however, certain that the typical amok is the result of circumstances such as domestic jealousy or gambling losses, which render a melee desperate and weary of his life. In fact, it's a melee equivalent of suicide. The act of running amok is probably due to the causes of which the culprit has some amount of control, as the custom has now died out in the British possessions of the peninsula. In other words, the great white man has come here and taken over, and so now, these backward natives will no longer do this stuff, right? Super racist attitude. Unfortunately, that's what you found in these sort of colonial racist attitudes back in the day. Okay? There are other versions of this we find in Asia. There's one called Kiru in Japan, suddenly explosive acts of rage. And this may be also related to social isolation as well as suicidal thoughts. Perpetrators are almost always young men. Killings are especially gruesome, and the weapons include knives and vehicles. Again, why knives and vehicles? Because they don't have guns in Japan. Very hard to get a gun in Japan. Okay? Now, all sorts of examples of amok. There are actually some that are really relatively recent. This is in, I believe, the Philippines. A 13-year-old girl witnessed her classroom. The guy came in the classroom, ran amok, killed the teacher, started slashing at kids, and this is the aftermath. And the kids this poor girl's totally traumatized by this, and they're trying to talk to her about it. And again, this can kind of overlap with somebody like, you know, the guy down in southern, like in LA, who went into the beauty parlor and started shooting people up because his ex-wife worked there. So sometimes you'll find some of these things overlapping, you know. Anyway, you get that. It's very tragic. Poor little girl, right? Ex-convict who runs amok is stoned to death. So here he is. He ran amok. Now everybody's caught him, and the crowd is gathered around and just throwing rocks at him, stoning him to death. So you might look at this and think you might as well be living in, like, you know, 1200s. You know, here's the biblical times. There's a guy being stoned to death. You know, but he ran amok, so he was killing people. And this is the old way of taking the law into your own hands, is using rocks, stoning somebody to death. Okay. Now, running amok still happens, and those are from the mid-2000s, as examples. So again, this is something where when I first started studying this, I thought, wow, running amok, this is really a Southeast Asian thing. It really has no other counterpart. Nobody else in the world does this kind of weird behavior of running around and just killing people at random. And then I really started thinking about this and started thinking, like, no, running around and killing people is something that's very common, unfortunately. And I started thinking about other examples that might be like this from different parts of the world, that may have different culturally salient features. So one thing I looked at is I was looking at, like, few people who go crazy and start killing people. And one of the examples from back in the day is the berserkers, the Viking berserkers. Okay? And berserker can have different meaning. It can mean bear skin, which may refer to the bear skin the Viking warriors wore in the battle, or it may mean bear shirt, you know, just going out without any armor. During a battle, a Viking battle, berserkers would fly in an uncontrollable rage and begin attacking anyone nearby, including warriors on their own side. So typically what they would do is they would say, these guys are going berserk, we'll put them out in front. We'll let them go first, and we'll kind of hang back because we don't want to get killed by them. They would go attack the enemy, and when they kind of get killed or whatever, then we'll go in with the next wave, right? And the idea also is that they might be possessed by the spirit of a bear or wolf. Now, in this case, unlike what I was telling you about amok before, where we don't really think about drugs like PCP, there has been some speculation for berserkers that they ingested some sort of psychoactive drug, bog myrtle, which they put in alcohol, or Amanita muscaria mushrooms. And this theory was tested not by researchers because it's unethical, but by reality TV people. In 2004, a TV program where they trained a volunteer to use typical Viking weapons, and then they gave him some Amanita muscaria. You cannot do this in the United States, by the way. And his fighting ability turned out to be greatly reduced. So we kind of like put that one off the table. He had to look like the drugs really make this person a better fighter. And then they thought about maybe drunken rage. Maybe they just got drunk and then went out. And also working themselves up into a psychological frenzy. They thought about maybe Paget's disease, characterized by out-of-control growth causing painful pressure in the head. There's a good Star Trek episode that's similar to this. I'm always thinking that in the back of my mind. And then there's all sorts of other things: manic depression, epilepsy, rabies, hysteria, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so this is one of the things. Maybe amok, maybe not. You know. Here's one that's a little more closer to home: suicide by cop. And this, unfortunately, is really quite common. And this is also something that we've had it happen here in the area. There was a case in Simi Valley where the guy pulled up to the cop station and just started shooting, and the cops all came out and killed him. And this is defined as an actual form of suicide, where it's an incident where a suicidal individual intentionally engages in life-threatening and criminal behavior with a lethal weapon or what appears to be a lethal weapon toward law enforcement officers or civilians, specifically to provoke the officers to shoot the person. Okay? And so this, unfortunately, and we had a case in Camarillo where there was a crazy guy attacked a cop with a knife, possibly suicide by cop. Don't know. Possible. He's also mentally disturbed. But, certainly he was doing something that, the cop told him to put the knife down many times and finally ended up having to shoot him because he was coming at the cop. So this happens a lot. Okay. Yes?
This happened in my ER when I was working there about 15 years ago.
Yeah.
We had a homeless man, or mentally disturbed man come in and he started stabbing our employees in the ER waiting room. And we were working on them, the cops came, he went and dropped the knife, they tried hitting him with the bags, they hit him with the rubber bullets, he still dropped it, picked it back up, and then went for the cop. And they tried to wing him and shoot him in the head, but unfortunately the bullet.
They usually do not do that. Usually when the cops shoot you, they aim for the center mass of your body.
Yeah. They were trying to, because he was nobody around him at that point. They cleared out a waiting room. But unfortunately, it ricocheted and it took out his portal vein, so he, his liver, so he did pass away.
They didn't case him, huh?
But we found out, talking to his, I guess a police officer talking to his roommate, that, when they tracked him down, said,
Yeah, he was thinking about it, yeah. So this may be related to a muck, in that the attacks can be random, and sometimes the attacks are planned to get the attention of police. In some cases, the attacker only threatens violence to try to get the police to shoot them. Or they might kill people, stab people, and to get the attention of the police. And a lot of times the person will have self-esteem issues, very similar. They'll suffer some great shame or some sort of like narcissistic wounding to their sense of self-esteem. And again, this is a way they can build that back up. Okay. Estimated of 11% of police shootings and incidents and 13% of justifiable homicides are related to suicide by cop. Many instances it's difficult to establish whether or not it's a case of suicide by cop, so those are probably low estimates. One study found between 1998 and 2006 that in 707 officer shooting incidents, 36% were due to suicide by cop. This is very stressful for the cops that are involved in this. Okay, cops typically, and I'm talking about the good cops, not the bad ones that are going out and shooting black people and doing those kind of things, because like in any profession, there are always bad apples, right? But the majority of cops do not want to go around and shoot people. Okay, that's not fun for them. It's very depressing. It's very stressful for them. A lot of times they will involved in shooting. They will leave law enforcement as a career. They'll go do something else. They can have post-traumatic stress disorder from this, all sorts of things, because it's not a fun thing for police to do this. And I had this great video, and I don't know if this is still up or not. Oh, gosh. Let's see if it's still here. Keep taking it down. I don't know why. Anyway, I'll let you guys go. You can look it up on here. There's all sorts of lots of examples. Unfortunately now, lots of and you can see the prevalence, how common this is. Going postal, or we call this also office violence. We call it going postal. That's entered into our language. Going postal because this has happened many times at the post office. For whatever reason, the post office seemed to be a magnet for these sort of things, and we had a postal shooting up here in Santa Barbara not too long ago. Now, office violence, the FBI has defined 4 types. Violent acts by criminals who have no other connection with the workplace other than to enter robbery, to do a robbery, or commit some other crime. That's the standard thing. We don't count that. Violence directed at employees by customers, clients, patients, students, inmates, or others for whom an organization provides services. In other words, you go to the DMV, you're finally so fed up with your treatment at the DMV, you go nuts, and you bring a gun and you shoot everybody up. That could or could not be like a muck. Third, violence against coworkers, supervisors, or managers by a present or former employee. This is quite common. This could be in a muck situation. You get fired from a job, you lose self-esteem, and you go back and you make sure that nobody forgets you. Shoot them up, right? And violence committed in the workplace by someone who doesn't work there but has a personal relationship with an employee, an abusive spouse, or domestic partner.
Like the
this could be a form of a muck too. And this is what happened in that case of the hairdresser down in LA, and the guy showed up and it was his ex-girlfriend or ex-wife, and he went amok and he killed everybody. Again, lost self-esteem, right? She left him, maybe she leaves him for another guy, he loses self-esteem, so this is his way of going back and getting that back.
Did you say the YouTube shooter would be a case of that?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that seems like it's either 3 or 4. Okay. She didn't work there, right?
No, she was upset.
She was upset with yeah. And whether or not there's some delusion involved in that, and I'll talk a little bit about delusional cases as well, because this is something that, like the standard of muck from Asia, these people typically don't have some sort of delusion, not really typically psychotic. Mm-hmm. But we find in sort of the American version of these things, sometimes there's some delusional processes going on. Okay. Yes?
Is it that like what happened at the Paper Source at the mall?
Yeah. That luckily turned out not to be a mass killing.
Yeah,
yes,
no,
yes,
it's
he went
the
in, his
murder
ex-wife or
suicide.
ex-girlfriend was there, and he shot her.
Ex-wife.
Yeah. Now, that happens a lot. That also can be a form of domestic abuse. You know, we don't know whether he could have just as easily killed her at home, or if he was planning on killing up a bunch of people, if that was an amok type shooting or not. So that would be one of these shootings where we would put a question mark next to it, in my opinion. We don't really know in that case. And we'll probably never know because he's dead, right? He shot himself. So a lot of times
Actually, he
people will
went to
shoot
the
themselves
hospital. I don't
too.
know if he died.
Didn't he die? I thought he died. I don't know. Anyway, you can look that up. But a lot of times these people will shoot themselves. You know, they'll do the act, they'll get the infamy, you know, and then they will finish themselves off, right? Now, here's a video clip. I hope this is still up because it's pretty interesting. It's actually a real office. I'll turn down the crappy music. Turn the lights down a little bit too. So every day at the office. Finally had too much. Anybody ever had a job where, you know, you felt like belittled by your boss, your coworkers, put you down all the time, your self-esteem just went down in the toilet? Here's a guy who just finally snaps. I don't know, maybe you guys have always had good jobs. I mean, I don't condone this behavior, but I can certainly understand the motivation, what might lead up to it.
Yeah.
This is why everybody in the military drinks.
Yeah.
That's why I did.
There you go. There you go. The obligatory throwing of computer
It's the
monitors.
second monitor.
Yeah, we get in trouble for that.
Yeah.
It has an input computers.
Now I just stomp on some stuff. It goes nuts.
Back there just keeping it with his phone.
Yeah.
I think it's.
Now he gets an axe.
Oh my God, go to the place.
Copy machine's got to get it. You know the copy machine. You can destroy something in the office. You know the copy machine deserves it.
Everybody's the office with their phone.
That's the scene from Office Space when they take the copier out to the
Yeah.
back and
Copy machine always.
Yeah.
One thing if you work in an office, you hate the copy machines.
Oh my God.
They're always breaking. Okay, so that was not a very good clear angle, but luckily for us, we got another angle of the same thing. Somebody else, that guy taking the phone picture, here he is. So you got another angle of it. Here he is, going at the copy machine. Now, he's not hurting people too much. He's not killing anybody. But again, you can think of this as sort of, you know, he will always be remembered in that office. He's raising his self-esteem. He has feelings of shame, low self-esteem. This is a way that you remedy that, right? Now, everybody's going to know who you are. You're going to be infamous. Right? P.T. Barnum said no such thing as bad publicity, right? You know, no such thing as bad attention. It's just attention. No such thing as bad, attention. You're famous or infamous, it doesn't matter.
Well, it kind of reminds me of like when a circus animal just goes berserk.
Yeah.
You know, like you're in this cage and
Yeah. They're trying to stop him. Finally, somebody steps up. You finally get him on the ground. This guy's still filming with the phone on his So there you go. All right. Now back in the day, if this had been back in the day in Malaysia, he would have had a knife, he would have killed people. At this point, they would have killed him.
Yeah.
Right? So get very much like running amok. And again, you would say, oh, he ran amok in the office, right? Very similar underlying psychological motivation. Okay.
Is it just kind of like emotions, probably like, simmering until like they
Yeah,
explode?
but this idea of loss of self-esteem, again, if you've ever worked in a really toxic environment where your self-esteem is constantly, people are belittling you, putting you down, you can't leave because you need the job, and you just, this is the idea, eventually just go nuts, right? It's the idea. You have to you repair that self-esteem. Now, we'll get down to the school shooters. So school shooters, in my opinion, relate to this amok pattern. A school shooting is a Western version of amok that has Western salient features. The biggest Western salient features of school shooters is what?
Gun.
Guns. They don't use knives, okay? But guns are readily available, easy to get guns, and I'm not taking a side on the gun, whether we should have guns or not. I'm not taking a, political side here. I'm just stating a fact, okay? Now, how you want to deal with that, you can decide amongst yourselves. Should you arm all the teachers and students with guns themselves, or should you ban guns forever, throw them all in the ocean? You guys decide that. I'm not taking a side, with regard to this lecture on that, but I'm just saying that guns are the salient feature here, right? They're in Malaysia, they got knives. You're in America, you got guns, okay? These guys have guns. Also, the question of whether people at this age should be able to purchase firearms, whether people who have mental disturbances should be able to purchase firearms. I will go and take a stand on that. I think that, whatever you believe about guns, I think mentally ill people should not be allowed to get guns. Okay. If you think about that for a second, that makes sense, right? So we have Columbine, and you guys all know about the Columbine story. The other salient feature of Western amok school shooters. It may be different than what you see in Southeast Asia.
Isolation?
No. What? No. Maybe, yes. Here's the deal. We don't know in the specific instances of muck in Southeast Asia, we don't know if there was planning involved. At least not that I've been able to determine. I wouldn't say that planning is not, I wouldn't rule out planning in Southeast Asian amok. I wouldn't rule it out. I wouldn't rule out planning in office violence. Maybe, maybe not. Office shootings, anyway. We don't really know. But yes, in the Western ones, at least in the Columbine shooting, there was planning, and planning is very important in preventing these things, because planning means they've come up with the plans, and then what happens is they leak the plans. So leakage is very, very common. They call it leakage. Leakage is very, very common, and leakage is the reason these things get thwarted. They tell somebody who tells somebody in authority, and then the authorities come in and they actually prevent it from happening. So leakage is very important. I say that to you guys because if you hear anybody talking about this kind of stuff, you should definitely go tell somebody in authority, a teacher or a cop, whatever, because that's how these things get stopped. Okay? And in cases where it was leaked and the person didn't say anything, or where they didn't do anything, that's where they happen. So leakage is very important. And so the planning for the Western, so maybe we can compromise. We can say in the Western versions of this sort of amok sort of thing, the planning is more overt. Okay. The other salient feature is that I think in a lot of the Western cases we can also probably diagnose some sort of mental illness or at least abnormal mental pattern of behavior. Okay. Which in the muck case, the traditional muck cases, I'm not too sure about that. It may be that they're there and nobody cared about to look into these things. They might be there, but certainly in the Western versions of it, we can look at these guys and we can go, yeah, they had some, there's some pathology there. Okay? Significant pathology. Not all the time, but in a lot of the cases. Okay? And certainly in Columbine, we know that there was some of this. Okay? And you guys have seen, I'm not going to show too much of this, you've seen, and they've taken it down now, videos of the Columbine shooting. They went into the school, they found people like in the cafeteria, they were just brutally shooting people. They set off bombs with propane canisters that didn't work very well, and then eventually ended up killing themselves. So they went out with a blaze of infamy. And these are people who had this sort of standard amok pattern of having low self-esteem, having been bullied, having lost any sort of narcissistic, view of themselves. They were viewed very poorly by people, by themselves, and this is their way of repairing that. Yes?
I think a pertinent case study for this would be Columbine, the Virginia Tech shooting.
Hold on a second. We're going to get to that. Okay? We'll get to that. Now, do I have it in here? I took it out. These guys, I can't remember, it was Klebold and Dylan. I can't remember which one was which. One of them, was it Dylan? Was the guy who was sort of like, he was a little bit more psychopathic, a little more, was the other way around Klebold?
One was Alpha.
Eric Harrison.
What's it?
Eric Harris.
Harrison, yeah, I get the names mixed up. What are the names again?
Eric Harris and Dylan.
Harrison and Kleinwood, right? Yeah, Harris Klein. So Harris was the dominant one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so he was the guy, he was more psychopathic, a little bit more, seemed a little more like, I don't say necessarily personality disordered, but he seemed a little more like, pathological personality traits, right? A little narcissistic, a little psychopathic. And he sort of manipulated the other guy, Harris, who was a little bit more depressed, okay? And depressed and maybe a little bit mentally not quite there. Some people think maybe a little schizophrenia, we're not quite sure. But they both had the same idea. I mean, this idea that, the loss of self-esteem, we're going to repair this, and we're going to, the shame, loss of self-esteem, we're going to repair this, repair that narcissistic wounding. Everybody's going to know who we are. Okay? And of course, Columbine for this country was really a landmark event that really changed a lot of stuff in this country. I mean, now that the fact that high schools have police presence, and that people are really worried about this. They do all sorts of active shooter drills, all these things. All this stuff started with Columbine. Okay? Now, they've done some studies. The FBI has done studies of school shooters, and they found a number of different things. I'm not going to go through all these sort of things. These are things that are related to school shooters. The problem with all these things here is that these are not specific to school shooters. Okay, you just pick some of these: alienation, narcissism, dehumanizes other, lack of empathy, attitude of superiority. Well, that could be like some cheerleaders. Not just school shooters, right? All these things together. They also talked about the school characteristics: students detached. The school has tolerance for bullying. This is where you get all these anti-bullying programs now. Inequitable discipline, inflexible culture, pecking order, code of silence. Well, how many schools have these? Lots. Okay. So again, not a lot of these are really specific enough to really be helpful in preventing school shootings, to identify people who are going to become school shooters. They can be helpful. They're helpful. And, a lot of times, people at the school will say, oh yeah, if anybody's going to go nuts, it's going to be that guy, right? If he's going to start shooting everything up, it's going to be that guy. Because, people intuitively may intuit a lot of these things. But the big thing here is leakage. If they make plans, they start talking about, or, like in the case of the Virginia Tech shooter, he wrote an English paper, I want to kill all these people, I want to do all these things, and the professor was very concerned and brought it to the attention of the dean and the authorities, and they did nothing about it. Okay? There was leakage, and they did. So the thing is here, and this is a big question because it's people's civil rights. When do you intervene? When do you intervene? Somebody, maybe they don't leak directly that they have a plan, they're going to kill people, maybe they write a paper, where they have a fantasy about killing people. Do you intervene at that point? People have civil rights. Do you have a right to say, well, I'm going to kick you out of school, or I'm going to send the police around to watch you day and night because you this fantasy of this thing you said, and you just come back and say, well, I play a lot of video games. I was just making a story about what's happening in my video game, right? I don't know. Maybe some of these other things on the list are salient too. And at some point you draw a line in the sand. You say, this is the person we're going to follow. Clearly somebody who has psychopathic characteristics. Here's a kid who wet his bed, he tortured animals, he lit a lot of fires when he was younger, and now he's in high school and he's making threatening gestures. Yeah, maybe that's a kid, we don't want to let him have a gun, But where do you draw the line? And one of the things the FBI and other people are trying to do now is trying to figure out where you draw the line. Yes?
Is that considered the serial killer trinity, those three symptoms in early childhood?
That's the trinity for psychopaths. Serial killers are a little different than school shooters. This is I'm glad you brought that up. But you asked your question first.
Oh, I was wondering, what does bedwetting have to do with those?
Bedwetting is one of the things that we find people become psychopaths later. A lot of them were bedwetters as kids. Does that mean everybody who wet their bed is going to turn into a psychopath? No.
What do they think?
But if you were a bedwetter and you were the cat killer of your neighborhood and you like to light fires, then that maybe puts you a little bit at worry.
But
and we know you were
they,
abused as a kid. That would also put you at risk.
Why do they think that is? Why did they think?
I don't know. It's just a thing that they've noticed. Kids probably got anxiety.
Just as
and
kids, though, not
Crohn's.
as adults. They don't have bedwetting. Just
Yeah, just
with
kids.
childhood.
As kids, yeah. doesn't mean that a lot of people wet the bed. Okay,
Oh, no, I
and
was
their
just
kids.
curious,
So
because that's,
it-
that's interesting. It seems kind of random.
It's one of the constellation of symptoms.
Yeah.
Okay, so serial killers are very different. Serial killers are different in that they do not want to be caught. A muck shooter, this is why I say the school shooters are the muck pattern. Because muck killers, suicide by cop, school shooters generally want people to know who they are. They want to know, they want to get that blaze of infamy before they get killed or captured. Serial killers do not want to get captured. Serial killers stay under the radar. That's why some of the serial killers, most famous ones, have never been caught. You've never caught the Zodiac killer, right? They don't want to get caught. They want to keep doing it. They have sexual sadistic impulses, a little bit different. Okay, and I think Deb's going to talk about serial killers when she's here next week. So I don't want to say too much about them. But you let me know if she talks about them, or if she doesn't, I can mention them more. But they're different. And again, this is one of the big differentiations between these school shooters and serial killers. School shooters are not serial killers. Okay?
So like, one last thing.
Yeah.
It's like, might be drawing lines in the sand, but like, it seems more closer to like the going postal or the spree killer than it would
Yeah.
to the school shooter.
Yeah.
Just in the sense of like, once again, like the planning stages and like you were saying, leakage and stuff like that.
Yeah, we don't know much about the planning stage, and again, depending on which school shooting you look at, you can see a variability in the planning stages. So again, in some of the cases we don't know, the muck killers, we don't know about the planning stage. The planning may be a differentiating factor, and it may not be. A lot of these things are kind of a spectrum, okay? What you see in the traditional muck killing is the guy just suddenly goes nuts and starts killing people, but you don't really see what happens before that. As we're, now with school shooters and with everything, this is a big deal, so we've really been studying it, we're really drilling down in the details of these people, and, we're seeing cases of leakage and things like this. As far as I know in the muck killings that, we haven't really, there hasn't been that level of scrutiny. So whether it's a degree of planning difference or whether it's a level of scrutiny difference, my opinion is I don't think I know yet. But I do think that planning, specific planning and organizing could be a salient in the Western version of it. To me, all these are like muck shootings, and they just have different, the salient features are slightly different. But the underlying motivation and cause of the behavior, I think, is very similar. That's my opinion. You could argue. You could make a pretty good argument against that. It's something I'm still working on, but in my mind, I think the underlying motivation is very similar. As for a serial killer, it's different. Serial killer motivation is very different. They enjoy the stuff, they get their jollies, they may get their sexual jollies from it, and they want to keep doing it, and they don't want to get caught. That's different. Yes?
Shouldn't white be on that list?
Yeah.
Yeah, not necessarily. But yeah, you do see this among a lot of white males, but it's not necessarily the case. Cho, who was a Virginia Tech shooter, was not white, and I'll talk about him in a minute. Okay. Yes.
Well, I think they're all related to the thing of social death. Have you heard about that? It's like where you're in a society and you're treated basically lower than human. Marginalized.
Yeah.
So it could be someone who is narcissistic, who believes they're better than everyone else
Yeah.
in a society that's,
Yeah.
giving them.
I mean, that's
something
essentially
more.
what I'm describing by saying low self-esteem and narcissistic. Yeah, that's exactly right. And again, a lot of these guys are white, but that doesn't mean that they don't feel marginalized.
Right.
But you find other versions, again, you can see this in different versions. And again, the mental health stuff can vary, So, the Columbine shooters, maybe the guy's a little psychopathic, narcissistic, and the other guy's kind of depressed, maybe a little schizophrenic. Well, you go to Virginia Tech shooting, and the guy he's really psychotic. Paranoid psychotic, right? So he's different, right? So you might find some different salient features around the mental health thing. But again, we don't really know much about the mental health backgrounds of a lot of the traditional muck killers, the guys with the knives running around. Because again, there's not been the drill down into them. Now, another thing that people thought about, people looked at warning signs related to this. What they found out is stuff that they're commonly, the common mythology about school shooters, though they dress. Guy dressed like a goth. He's got long trench coats. Columbine guys are known as trench coat mafias, or they dress like a goth or something. No, that has nothing to do with school shooting. Okay. Video games. do not seem to be correlated with school shooting, violent video games. Because we'd see a lot more of it if violent video games were. So musical preferences. I listen to death metal, so that makes me at risk for school shooting. No. Okay. Other aspects of the lifestyle, etc. Okay, these are not good warning signs. Warning signs are specific actions that students engage in that constitute attack-related behaviors, and again, this is anything related to preparation, stockpiling weapons, diagramming the school, to planning, writing down the plans and telling people about it. Okay, the leakage, most important thing. Okay? Somebody says, hey, don't go to school on Wednesday because bad things may be happening. And you know that guy has a bunch of guns. Maybe you go have a little conversation with the cops about that. Hey, this guy told me this, the other day. Some very controversial stuff is that saying that a lot of these guys who do these kind of things have been taken serotonin reuptake inhibitor antidepressants, SSRIs. It's very controversial. I don't think it's been proven, but some people think this may be something related. They're depressed or whatever, and now they take these things, and now they're able to, act out on this stuff. One thing that's been interesting, they talk about drawings that these guys who are on SSRIs who do these things make. A lot of times they're missing the head. I don't know if that has anything to do with anything. It's very interesting. But this is very controversial. Some people say, well, if everybody on SSRIs became a school shooter, we wouldn't have any population anymore. So again, something in there. If you want to study this for your doctoral dissertation, that's something you could look at. Yes?
Maybe there's no head because it helps them dehumanize.
Maybe. We don't really know. Okay? Again, this is something that definitely needs more research. Okay. Now, FBI recommends further study, obviously, in regard to school shooters, looking at the presence of psychopathic and narcissistic personality traits in offenders. I think that is important. Significance of verbal and written leakage, determining what specific school dynamics appear to be risk factors in schools, and this is the one that's a big debate right now. Because you're saying if you arm the teachers in the school, that will make it much more difficult for this kind of stuff to happen. And other people will say, no, the teachers aren't going to be well trained with guns. Cops are barely well trained with guns. Teachers are not going to get training, and they just end up shooting more of each other. And again, people argue about this back and forth. I have friends who are cops. They argue about this stuff back and forth. But anti-bullying programs, all these kind of things, try to make the school a place where, there's a guy like Harris, maybe we identify him early, and we talk to him, we make him feel welcome, we engage him, so that he doesn't become a school shooter later on. Maybe. Okay, there's not a lot of proof for this stuff. Influence and relevance of suicide and suicidal ideation in adolescents who have been involved in school shooting. This is tough because a lot of adolescents think and ideate about suicide. Identifying significant commonalities between the school shooter's personality background and family circumstances and those of other violent adolescents. I think this is an area where a study could possibly be very useful. And identifying significant commonalities and differences between adolescent school shooters and adult offenders involved in workplace violence. So again, this would go back to what you were saying, sort of differentiating some of the subtypes of the sort of amok stuff. Now, the good news is that the number of school shootings in general has gone down over the years, but this is only up until 2009. So I think this may have gone up a little bit since then, but it has been trending down in general since the 1990s. Still very difficult, I want to get across here, very difficult to profile a school shooter beforehand. Easy to do it in retrospect, hard to do it beforehand. And here's Harris and Clyde. Well, I did have the names in here. Okay. So Harris had a sort of sadistic personality, antisocial, narcissistic, paranoid, like a malignant narcissist. Klebold, conflict avoidant, maybe psychotic, depressed, gullible. Cho, who was the Virginia Tech shooter, he had selective mutism, social anxiety, severe withdrawal and isolation, depressed, and was clearly delusional and paranoia. Had a lot of paranoia. Somewhere there's a video of him talking. You'll see just how paranoid and delusional he is. He's very paranoid, very delusional. He had been in treatment by a psychiatrist for this stuff. And they, at a certain point, okay, yeah, he's good enough, give him the meds and send him on his way. And again, this also points out one of the issues is this sort of lack of safety net for these individuals, that nobody followed up on him. And then nobody followed up when he was making threatening comments, and et cetera, in his schoolwork. And so again, the ball gets dropped in multiple places, and then these guys can, manifest. And so this is also one of the problems. Okay. So one thing I wanted to mention, we covered last time, it was really the amok pattern of killing, right? Which in my view, the amok is the sort of the basic pattern that then gets elaborated depending on what culture you're in. And in American culture, we tend to elaborate this with guns because we got lots of guns here. And I think Deb showed you a slide about gun deaths around the world, right? Different ways that people get killed around the world, and she probably said something to the effect of, like if we didn't have guns here, that people would be knifing each other and those kind of things. And that slide she shows you that, right? You see in Europe and other places, knife deaths are as big or bigger than gun deaths, right? But I don't know, did she show you the other slide? The other slide just shows you basically the number of deaths. And of course, the number of homicides in the United States is way huger than any place else because it's easy, you kill more people with guns. And I'm not saying this to be anti-gun, but guns kill more people. And so we have a lot more homicides. The sheer numbers of homicides is greater in the United States. And so I think it's good to see both sides of the story, right? One is kind of pro-gun, one's kind of a little more anti-gun. So it's good for you to see both. I'm not sure she showed you the second one or not. Yes?
She actually told us that the U.S. was number 31 and homicide number 1's Honduras.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Honduras is a rough place. Yeah, there's places that, again, if you look at sheer numbers, if you adjust it by population, you'll see things like that. If you look at sheer numbers, we're up and near the top. Okay. Yeah, but there are places that are very rough. Maybe some of you guys have visited some of those places. I don't know. I can always give you travel recommendations if you want.
Been there.
But we certainly, and again, I'm not taking a stand on gun stuff. There's definitely guns are definitely in the mix with this stuff. Okay? And certainly, it's part of the American cultural expression of the amok pattern. So the other thing that Deb probably didn't talk about, but I'll talk a little bit about it, is that there is also a gender difference in the amok pattern. Okay, that we do not have too many females who run amok in a traditional way, either with guns or with knives or whatever. It's fairly rare, though there have been some postal shootings that have been perpetrated by females, and of course that recent shooting at YouTube was a female. Whether that falls into the category of a mass shooting or not, my thought is still out on that. Because she was really it was like a lover's revenge thing, I guess that's what it looks like. And so I'm not quite sure that falls into the category. But you are seeing some females doing this stuff, but it's more rare. And in the typical amok pattern, one of the theories is that women express this in a different way. So again, it's loss of self-esteem, these kind of things underlying the amok pattern. For women, they tend to do something else, and some people believe that for women, the amok pattern takes the place of this disorder called Lata. Again, this also comes from Southeast Asia, and Lata is, the good thing about it is it's not violent. And someone suffering from Lata, usually it's women, will lose control of their behavior, and they might start doing something like a sort of obsessive mimicking of speech and behavior of other people nearby. And they will also at times blindly obey any commands that are given to them. And again, this is mostly found in Southeast Asia, but there are variations in other parts of the world, mostly but not exclusively found among adult women. And people in Southeast Asian culture who are afflicted with Lata are not considered to be responsible for their behavior during an active episode. And again, the idea is that this may have the similar kind of underlying psychology as amok, loss of self-esteem and these kinds of things. Now, one place where we see Lata in Southeast Asia, this thing, but if we go all the way over to Maine, you guys know where Maine is, you know your geography of the United States. Really? Yeah, East Coast geography, not a big concern among Californians, is it, right? It's freaking cold over there, people are weird, that's all you know about them, right? But if you look at East Coast, you know where New York City is, above New York City is Boston, and above Boston is Maine, way up there near Canada, okay? And up in Maine, way back in the 1800s, a disorder was described, and they named this the jumping Frenchman of Maine. You guys know that Canada was settled by French people as well as people speaking English, and so there's parts of Canada where people speak French. And it was observed among French-Canadian lumberjacks in Maine that they had a disorder that was very similar to Lata. It was a hyper-startling disorder. In other words, people could get startled and they would have an extreme reaction. And unlike Lata, the jumping Frenchmen of Maine were mostly men. And they've looked into this, and they actually think that this is related to a genetic mutation of the nervous system resulting in irregularities of the startle response. The startling causes an exaggerated response, which includes yelling, flailing of the limbs, twitching, and sometimes convulsions. After the initial startling, the person is almost immediately susceptible to another episode of being startled. And there have been reports of these so-called jumpers being cruelly teased, and they will sometimes, like in Lata, obey commands given to them. And they will also sometimes mimic people, mimic speech. So it seems very similar. So if somebody wanted to do a very interesting doctoral dissertation, you could go study this, and then you could go out to Southeast Asia, find people suffering from Lata, and maybe do a genetic analysis to see if they've got this same genetic variant. To my understanding, that has not yet been done. So that would be very quite interesting. I would encourage you to do that for your graduate school thing. Unfortunately, your education psychology majors here has not prepared you well for studying genetics. You will have to go do that in graduate school because we do not give you a course on genetics and epigenetics, which I think is a crying shame. But you can learn this stuff, and you will learn this in graduate school, and so I think you should go off and do that. It'll be interesting. And then I'll update my lecture. Okay, let's talk about some other culture-bound syndromes. Here's one of my favorites called Kuro. K-O-R-O, to be distinguished from Kuru, K-U-R-U, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Kuro is a delusional disorder where a man, usually a man, believes his penis is shrinking and retracting into the body. This is accompanied by panic and fear of death, because when the shrinkage completely finishes, the person will die. That's the belief. It's thought that if some men go to the point of tying or clamping something to the penis to prevent the retraction. And this may be related to a traditional Asian belief, actually not just in Asia, in other places, that unhealthy or non-normative sexual acts, masturbating, visiting prostitutes, wet dreams, etc., disturb the body's internal balance, which does not occur with normal sex. When this occurs, the vital, supposedly yang essence of the male is lost, and there's a belief that if a ghost can get a penis from a living man, they can come back to life. All sorts of very interesting beliefs related to this, which we don't have time to go into. Sometimes Kuro is thought to be transmitted through food, and there have been a number of cases of mass delusion involving Kuro. Okay. Whole cities, countries believe this is an epidemic that's happening. Females can suffer from a version of this. It's much more rare, and this is where they believe their nipples or vulva are retracting. Same kind of thing. And again, this is also susceptible to mass delusion. Right? Yes?
In the readings, it talked about how they suffered from Kuro after trying marijuana. Is that?
Yes. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Yes. Very, very good. I'm glad you brought that up. There's been some cases reported in Europe, and there's been a few cases reported in these places that seem to involve the smoking of marijuana. In fact, the cases that we have from the West seem to involve marijuana. Now, there's a possibility, people have theorized that marijuana can disrupt hormones, male hormones. There may be some evidence for that. That could slightly be related to this. We don't really know. Okay, we don't really know. There haven't been a lot of cases of this, but again, one of the potential things that we may see now that we have this great natural experiment of legalizing marijuana, we may have people actually come forward with these sorts of things, and we may see this now more. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see. Before marijuana is illegal, you know, people they have delusional beliefs, they don't come forward because they don't want to tell people they're smoking. It also may be that more people are going to start smoking, and so we may start seeing these things more. So we'll have to wait and see, okay? But that's again, I always encourage you as psychologists that, you know, this marijuana legalization is a great natural experiment. And so now we're going to be able to compare before and after and see what happens once people start using. And also the ability to do research on marijuana use is going to you know, now be facilitated. Okay? You're not going to get federal funding for it, but it's possible that there may be state funding or other private funding for research on marijuana use. So we're going to, you know, again, if you guys go off to graduate school and get PhDs and become researchers, this is something that, you know, maybe may become open to you now that it was closed before. Yes?
But you don't need marijuana for this to happen?
No. In Asia, it's not related to marijuana use. Okay? Not related to marijuana use. And we don't really know much about it. Again, the mass delusional stuff is like everything else I've been telling you, that if one person believes it, then you can get somebody else to believe it. All right? And again, this is with all the crazy stuff that we've been talking about here, you know, Stockholm Syndrome, everything. One person believes it, you know, two people believe it, then it's a movement, and people will jump on the bandwagon, and that seems to be part of our human heritage, that we're really gullible that way. And so, you know, one guy, you know, believes his penis is retracting. You know, he watched the Seinfeld episode where George jumped in the water, and then the little girl saw him, you know, and like he's yelling around, shrinkage, shrinkage, and the guy sees that, he gets an idea in his head, becomes fixated on it, he goes around, he very convincingly tells other people, they start to believe it, and then, you know, I don't know why it's happened, I must have been that, you know, crab I ate last night or something, you know, and then, oh, I ate crab last night too, oh my God, you know, like, and then people start to believe it, and again, this is something that human beings do, okay? And again, you only have to look as far as any of our political, it doesn't matter which side you're on politically, political stuff or stuff going on in the national interest, and you will see this kind of behavior going all the time, okay? Seems slightly less delusional than Koro, but not much, okay? Not much. And there's a lot of weird stuff out there that people believe, okay? So again, it has nothing to do, there's no necessarily factual basis of this stuff. There's all it is that you know, you just get one more person to believe it, and then, you know, people will follow, whatever. Okay. Again, the goal of this class is that you will all become inoculated to this sort of thing, and, you know, when you start thinking, hey, that's a little weird, you will take a step back and maybe then think about applying the scientific method and testing a hypothesis before you come to the conclusion that, you know, that some part of your body is retracting into someplace else. Now, as a Freudian, I can have a field day with this. I can look at you guys and say, you know, people, you know, bash Freud's theories all the time. Here is living proof of Freud's fear of castration. Here's a cultural manifestation of this, where you take the cultural beliefs about, you know, yin and yang and these kind of things that you find in Chinese medicine. By the way, shameless plug, take my Psych 344 class in the fall, and we'll talk to you about Chinese medicine. I'll bring somebody in here to demonstrate Chinese medicine. And again, you take these traditional beliefs, and then you combine them with Freud's, you know, castration fears, and here you go, you got Koro, right? So again, if you like Freud like me, here's a great proof to counteract all the Freud bashers.
So what food do they speculate is the cause?
I don't know what the food is. I just made up crab because it's a weird food. It's like a giant spider, sea spider that you eat. But I don't know. I don't know what the food was. Yeah, I don't know if that's in it. You look it up. If you can find it, let me know. Now, this also can be related to depersonalization, panic, obsessive compulsive disorder, psychosis, hysteria, body dysmorphia disorder, castration anxiety I just mentioned, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can find all sorts of things in the DSM that you can pin this kind of thing to. It's understudied, and so again, if you wanted to find something interesting to do in graduate school, here would be something really quite fascinating. And I will tell you in a minute of another one that's similar to this that also could be related. And of course, you could throw in marijuana smoking with this, and I think you could end up with a very nice dissertation. And by the way, here's a Seinfeld episode with George. I don't know if you guys watch Seinfeld or not, but it's a really funny episode, so it's good. All right. Oh, by the way, Koro, not to be confused with a condition known as microphallus, okay? And this is usually caused by a hormonal imbalance about 14 weeks after conception. I don't know if you've ever seen this thing. I had patients who had this, developmentally disabled patients who had other things going on. and you find people get this microphallus kind of thing. So this is not something that has been shrinking. This is something that just never really developed. Okay, and if you work in an institutional setting, sometimes you'll see this. Let's go to the next slide. Next. Sorry about that. All right. Now another one that's related to this is called DOT, semen loss syndrome, or in the Chinese, which I won't pronounce correctly, Xin Kui. Okay. And this is a syndrome that's well-described presentation from a lot of times mostly in the Indian subcontinent, also seen in China, and also seen in the Middle East. Okay. And it's characterized by an intense preoccupation with loss of semen in the urine and through nocturnal emissions, masturbation, and through sex. It's associated with fatigue and other somatic and psychological symptoms. And this again goes back to sort of these traditional beliefs about male sexual energy and the loss of that and things like that. Okay. It can be classified as a culture-bound syndrome, but some people have also thought that it really is a form of depression or anxiety. Now, I don't personally see that those things are mutually exclusive, and I think you'd see that you could say the same thing for Kuro too. A lot of anxiety comes along with this as well. Okay, symptoms: fatigue, hypochondriasis, somatic complaints. Usually older men, depressed. A lot of times they're married. They tend to be well educated. Tend to have some preoccupation with the genitals. And of course, we know preoccupation with genitals among older men is not something that's bound to certain cultures. We have that here. All you have to do is turn the Super Bowl on and watch the ads for the boner pills, and that our entire pharmaceutical industry has been, dedicated to making better boner pills for old white guys. You've heard my rant about that. So it's not that preoccupation is just not with people suffering from Kuro or people suffering from DAT. But that seems to be something that is pretty widespread. Okay? Other thing that we find with people that might have this, they may have a history of premature ejaculation and or impotence. Okay. And here's a slide for you. What's up? Anyway. Yes?
This is Indian. Is it that one country that's below India, or is it not?
No, it's found in the Indian subcontinent, so all around India and all around India, also into the Middle East and also in China to some degree.
So Kuro is also the same with all throughout Asia, Japan, China?
I don't know about Japan. I haven't run across any instance of this in Japan, but I do know China and in the Indian subcontinent. Again, places where they have a belief in sort of like a body system, a health belief in that your health requires balance of energy in the body, and then the excess sexual activity can deplete the balance of energy, change it, right? So in Kuro, you get the penis retracting. In DAT, you get all these symptoms related to too much emissions by the male. Okay. Yes.
So for their culture with the Kama Sutra, which is where you just prolong sex without any actual ejaculation.
Yeah.
Is that maybe related to this preoccupation of like?
I mean, it could be, and it also could be seen as something. Well, we don't want to have the man, ejaculate too much because it'd be bad for him. So we'll prolong things out, right? So you see some cultural things related to this, right? Now, of course, most of the people doing this aren't practicing the Kama Sutra, they're just, regular guys, whatever, and so, and again, there may be other things underlying this, other psychological disorders underlying this, but this is how it manifests. Now, if we were to look at Americans, and we were to go and do polls and find people using Viagra and, we might find, men here, for instance, who have a very similar profile, who have a, kind of similar stuff going on, but don't, they're not worried about the loss of the semen, but they might be worried about, impotence and loss of energy and all these other kind of things. Again, another very interesting thing to study, because this is another one. This and Kuro, are ones where, we may have Western versions of these things that we just haven't recognized yet. And so again, for me, this is very interesting to do this sort of comparison, of these culture-bound syndromes and find different versions in different places. I have an underlying suspicion that we would find something, at least underlying stuff similar in the West. I haven't proven that out yet in my own mind, but I've definitely been thinking about that. There may be something similar. Yes?
So I would think the reason they wouldn't want to lose their sperm is because they want to be able to use it to impregnate. So why would they be worried about losing sperm to sex?
These are older men. I think I think the belief is that if you lose all your sperm, that you're going to run out of energy, right? And
Okay, like
that's
you
gonna
lose your
lead
vitality.
Lose your vitality, and that eventually is going to be, related to your fear of death.
Okay.
So I mean that if I had to put my overlay on it, that's what I would say. But I think that's subject to verification. I think more research needs to be done.
Okay.
Yes.
Didn't Woody Harrelson abstain from release of old sperm because he said it kept the vitality within him, and that would be that syndrome?
And he smokes a lot of dope too. So yeah. No, I really think if you went and did a study here, I think you would find some, especially now that a lot of these Asian beliefs have come, especially to California. You'll find some similar stuff. And again, it's not that we haven't had these beliefs in the West, right? There's all sorts of beliefs about masturbation. You're going to get hair in your palms, you're going to go blind. I mean, it wasn't too long ago that people were telling their kids this. You go back to the 50s and the 40s and stuff. These were the things, masturbation's bad for you. You're going to go blind, hair on your palms, and become. And if you look in the psychological literature, you'll find, you'll become feeble-minded. You're going to go insane. There's a lot of that stuff out there. So again, those beliefs, they're not that much different than stuff we've had in the West. I don't think those things are being taught now in the West. Hopefully not, God forbid. But they were not too long ago. And so again, I think this is somebody wanted to do an interesting dissertation. I think this would be really interesting to go and see these kind of beliefs and compare them to these things. It'd be really quite fascinating. And I think you'd find something. Okay, another one is called susto or fright sickness. This is one you find this one a lot of times south of the border, Latin America. And this syndrome, a person believes that their soul has become separated from their body. Syndrome is associated with stress and affects women more than men, though there have been cases also involving children. It's usually triggered by a single stressful event, such as witnessing an accident, sudden or violent death of someone the sufferer is close to, or other traumatic, dangerous occurrences. Research has shown that the sufferer is aware of the condition, they have a much better prognosis, and it's been hypothesized to be related to PTSD, generalized anxiety disorder, depression, and schizophrenia. And the symptoms are anxiety, nervousness, anorexia or disturbance in eating patterns, listlessness, despondence or depression, involuntary muscle tics, typo there, diarrhea, etc., etc., etc. Now, the traditional treatment in Latin America is there's an herbal treatment, orange blossom, Brazil wood, and marijuana made into tea, with also figs boiled in vinegar. And there's a ritual called the limpieza, which is Spanish for cleansing, or the barrida, which is Spanish for sweeping. And this is done by a curandero. My cousin is from Honduras, and she was telling me, I was talking to her about this, and she was telling me that it's down the block from her house in Honduras. There's a curandera, and she said she'd get up any time, any morning of the day, and look out, and there would be a line around the block of people waiting to go in there for these rituals. Okay. Now, the ritual is most effective when it's conducted by one of these trained healers. And it has a number of features similar to modern therapies for PTSD, including recounting the details of the trauma. So, again, this form of folk medicine, they sort of figured out, some of the psychological aspects of this, and it's not rocket science. They've seen this over and over and over again, and through long experience, they've figured out, effective ways of treating this sort of post-traumatic stress-like syndrome. Yes?
Do they use EMDR?
No, they don't use EMDR. I mean, they may have stuff that's similar to it, but that would have to be, you have to go check that out. I don't know. But they do a lot of recounting the details of the trauma, and there's a ritual way that they sort of cleanse the person. Another great thing for a dissertation. Okay, another one that you may have heard of, it's south of the border, called nervios or ataque de nervios. We call this up in El Norte, we call this nervous breakdown, right? And of course, we had plenty of, especially back in the 50s and 60s, this was something that was really widely known, nervous breakdown. I'm going to talk about neurasthenia a little bit later on, and we may get something that's really related to this, so keep this in the back of your mind when I talk about neurasthenia later. But Nervios is similar to Susto, but rather than having one single stressful event, this tends to be related more to ongoing continual stressors. Okay? And the stressors are often related to family matters, and the causes have been attributed to anger, grief, giving birth. Having Susto previously can also make you more susceptible to this. Anxiety disorder and depression. And the symptoms include anxiety, headache, despair, facial pain, trembling, anger, worry, fear, confusion, difficulty sleeping, etc., etc., etc. And the treatment usually consists of taking patent medicines, nerve pills, and prayer. And while Susto is usually treated by the curandero, Nervios is typically treated more by a modern doctor. If you're in Latin America and you have this, you go to the modern Western doctor. If you have Susto, you may go to the curandero. And so this is a very interesting disorder. This one obviously has correlates with other places in the world. And again, also in North America, we have this. And I'm going to talk to you about neurasthenia and hysteria in a bit. And of course, I think these are probably very closely related. And you also see versions of this kind of thing in other parts of the world. We see a version similar, something in Asia. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And so, again, there's a cultural overlay on this. This is the deal back in the 50s and 60s. You had this, and basically you were just going to get prescribed pills. And back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, the pills changed, but typically this is what you will, if you go to the Western doctor with these kind of things, you're probably going to get some sort of anti-anxiety medicine, benzodiazepines, things like that for this. Which the problem with that is that benzodiazepines are very, very addictive, and the withdrawal is not pleasant, and so that can be an issue with these things. Back in the day in the United States, you get prescribed phenobarbital tranquilizers for these sorts of things, also very problematic as far as addiction and side effects and things like that. Now, talk about some other interesting ones. These ones are a little bit more rare, but also may have some similarity to what we've just been talking about. Something called Seora disorder. This is among the Seora tribe in the Orissa state of India, which is down here on the east side of India. And in this place, young men and women sometimes exhibit abnormal behavior patterns that Western trained mental health specialists would define as a mental disorder. They cry and laugh at inappropriate times, have memory loss, pass out, and claim to experience the sensation of being repeatedly bitten by ants when no ants are present. And this usually happens to people who are teenagers or young adults, and usually to people who are not attracted to the ordinary life of a subsistence farmer. In other words, these people are very, very poor, and they're living in a very subsistence farming lifestyle, not a lot to eat, not a lot of comfort in life, and they're under considerable psychological stress and social pressure placed on them by relatives and friends to sort of stay there and stay in the village and continue the lifestyle. Your dad was a subsistence farmer, so that's what you're going to do. Right. Well, I really like to go off to the university, maybe become a doctor. No, you got to stay here and farm dirt the rest of your life. Right. And so this creates a lot of stress. Now, the local explanation is that this behavior is due to the acts of supernatural beings who want to marry the young people who are suffering from this. And the resolution of the situation is to carry out a marriage ceremony in which the disturbed person is married to a spirit. Once this marriage has occurred, the abnormal symptoms apparently end, and the young person then many times will go in a different sort of career path and become a shaman. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff about shamanism. I don't have time to talk about it in this class a lot. I will talk about it in my 344 class to some degree, because that's really fascinating. Shamanism is very similar in all parts of the world. And one thing that's similar is that the shaman oftentimes will, in order to have a successor, will choose somebody who they have cured. Somebody will come to them with one of these kind of disorders, and the shaman will cure them, and the shaman will see in the person who suffers from disorder somebody who is sensitive to the sort of spirit world that the shaman needs to communicate and interact with as part of their job. And then a lot of times these people will then become the disciples. And this happens in this thing. And it seems, in the case of the Siora, to resolve the symptoms. And it kind of makes sense. You don't want to be a dirt farmer. You know, your parents aren't going to pay for you to go off to the university somewhere. You don't want to be a dirt farmer. But, you know, what's the next best thing? If I have to stay in the village, well, I can become a shaman. And then I'm somebody special, and I have specialized skill, and I don't have to sit there and farm dirt all day, you know. And so it seems to cure the symptoms. And so one way this example shows us that, you know, that one way of dealing with relatively minor mental illnesses could be views of, you know, ways of dealing with impossible social situations. In other words, these sort of minor mental illness sort of symptoms are coping mechanisms. And if we look at these things as coping mechanisms, then we can try to look for the underlying cause of these things. What's the person trying to cope with? And I think that can be very instructive in a lot of these kinds of things that we have going on here. Now, another interesting one is called the Shanti psychosis. And this disorder has two types. One is related to a frenzied guilt and fear, and the other one to depression. And most of it affects women from the West African countries, such as Ghana. And of course, it was first noted in the Shanti tribe people. And the frenzied fear and guilt type begins with the afflicted person believing they're being punished for something they did wrong. The sufferer becomes frightened and goes into a frenzy, and later they may experience a period of withdrawal, hallucinations, and Hebrinic type symptoms, which include dancing and singing. And, you know, Hebrinic schizophrenia is kind of schizophrenia. People, you know, just say nonsense words and, you know, just belt out stuff. They might rhyme. They might do some things like this. Also, they might, including dancing, they also can tear off clothes, and also coprophagia. You guys know what coprophagia is? Copro is the Latin word for shit, and phagia is the Latin word for eating. So I'll let you put the two together. And, so this type of Ashanti psychosis sometimes occurs after a person has been sick with a fever. So there may be some physiological correlate to it. We're not quite sure. In the depressive type, the sufferer claims to be a witch who has performed witchcraft that has harmed someone. And for young women, they often suffer from they often get this after they've had a difficult childbirth or some other illness or the death of an infant. Being witches and harming someone else without conscious intent is usually the thought. I didn't mean to hurt them, but I must have done it. So this may be a reaction to something going on and feeling some guilt. Okay? And we don't know much about this. This one's interesting, Arctic hysteria, or Pilblocht. I think I'm pronouncing that reasonably correctly. This is a very interesting one. The syndrome was found among the Inuit people of northern Greenland in the Arctic Circle. Inuit people, you would probably call them Eskimos. The sufferers exhibit behaviors that involve screaming, uncontrollable, flailing about, which can end in seizures and sleep characterized by a stupor. On waking, the sufferers do not remember the episode. Syndrome appears most often in the winter. For a long time, this was thought to be a culture-bound syndrome, a psychological syndrome. But, and this is very interestingly enough, they also found that the Inuit dogs suffer from this. So here is a clue. If there is a psychological disorder and suddenly you see that your dog is also suffering from the same disorder, that may be a clue that it's not psychological. Maybe something else going on, something in the environment perhaps. And so this is what happened. They started to look into this. And why would dogs get this, right? It's not going to be culture bound. This is a dog, right? And so they started to study this, and they found that what happened in the winter with these folks is that they ate seals, and they would cut the seals open, and then they would find the liver, and they would eat this liver. And the liver is a very rich source of food, right? Very good if you're in a cold place in the winter. But it's also full of vitamin A. And it turned out that people with this Pilblocht were ingesting too much vitamin A. They got hypervitaminosis of vitamin A, too much vitamin A, and it was causing the symptoms. And they got this basically from seal liver and from fish liver as well. It was a staple part of their diet. And if they stopped eating these things in excess, then it went away. So this is an interesting one. This points out the fact that you just can't assume things are psychological. And you also have to look at other possible physical or medical causes. Very, very important. Now, this is called brain fag. Fag is not the negative term that's sometimes applied to gay people. But fag here means, is short for fatigue. Okay, very important to know that. The disorder was found in West Africa among students who report that they feel their brains to be fatigued. Students suffered from poor concentration, memory deficits, and difficulty with problem solving, and the stress of being in school is a precipitating factor. They took these kids who had never been sitting in a school, you know, sort of the Western way of doing school, and they took them, they're not running around playing and doing whatever. They said, okay, we're going to herd you into this building, put you in this uncomfortable seat, and make you sit here for 8 hours a day. And then they started noticing these syndromes coming up. To my mind, this is something also you find in all sorts of cultures. I think we have it right here, especially when it gets near the end of the semester. I'm sure many of you are suffering from brain fag right now, being in classes, forced to sit in classes all day when it's beautiful and sunny out, and you'd rather be out running around doing stuff. But here you are, you have to be sitting here. You know, again, I have a high school student, living in my house, and this is, I think they all have this at some point, right? So again, it partly points out the sort of unnatural way that we herd kids into schools and make them sit in chairs all day. They've got all this energy and they want to run around and do stuff. So again, this is another one where I think there's probably different cultural variants pronounced here, because these kids were literally taken out of the village where they're running around all day and forced to sit in chairs for 8 hours a day. But I think we have something similar around here too. Another one that might be related to nervios or susto is called hayabung, or anger illness. This is found in Korea and some other East Asian countries. Sometimes called fire illness, affects primarily older, less educated rural women after menopause. It is triggered by some sort of emotional disturbance, usually related to stressful interpersonal conflict, so similar in that way to nervios. The syndrome may be related to a passive response to this conflict, and includes characteristics and symptoms such as sighing, heaviness or constriction in the chest, hot and cold flashes, which also could be related to menopause, insomnia, blurred vision, belief there's a tumor or mass in the stomach, anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsiveness, anorexia, paranoia, fearfulness, mild mental impairment, etc., etc., etc. Okay. And some people believe this may be related, cultural sort of position of women, that it's not, that women are not really encouraged or really allowed to express their emotional states, especially their anger. That they've got to just sort of suck up the anger and sort of swallow it, and then this leads to maybe these symptoms. That's been one theory about this. Now, another one that's really quite interesting, and this was written about by the very famous author William Burroughs, who wrote the book Naked Lunch. And this is called Bang Utot, or Sudden Unexpected Nocturnal Death Syndrome. And this is a syndrome that's been found in Laos, in the Philippines, as well as other places in Southeast Asia. It's known as Pokuri in Japan. And in this syndrome, a person dies in their sleep, presumably as a result of a spirit attack during dreaming. We know of the spirit attack from reports where people have been woken up from a dream, and they've said, wow, I was being attacked in the dream by a spirit. Okay, well, go back to sleep. And they go back to sleep, and now they die. Okay, so then wonder about this. People who have been subjected to trauma in their waking life seem to be most susceptible. Other causes have been speculated to be a thiamine deficiency. What's thiamine? Vitamin B1? B1 thiamine, very important. Hypoalkalemia, this is a potassium deficiency. Mental stress. Melioidosis, which is an infection by Burkholderia pseudomallei bacterium. Genetic problems and heart arrhythmias. Okay. Hasn't quite been tracked down yet, but again, there have been documented cases of this. Wendigo psychosis. This is an interesting one because we're not sure if this is a real thing or if this is one of those things where Native Americans got around and said, boy, we're really annoyed by all these white anthropologists coming in and bugging our sitting around here and asking us questions all the time. Let's make up a story to tell them, something interesting. So we don't really know. Okay? But Wendigo psychosis was found among the Algonquin Native American group of tribes, which include the Chippewa, Ojibwa, and the Cree. Sufferer is usually geographically isolated during the winter months and believes that he or she will turn into a cannibalistic monster. An intense fear that this may happen may drive the sufferer out in the cold. I'm stuck in the teepee or the house all winter. It's freezing outside, snow everywhere. I can't go anywhere, and if I stay here any longer, I'm going to go nuts and eat the people I'm living with. So the characteristics and symptoms are geographic isolation, inadequate food supply, poor appetite, nausea and vomiting, delusions, paranoia, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts and actions. But again, this one is a little suspect. That some people think this is something that was just made up. Basically to F with the anthropologists. Because, also winter, it's cold out, there's nothing to do, there's these stupid anthropologists hanging around here like, we're bored, let's make up a story, right? So again, this one's a little bit, we're not quite sure about. Fan death, I like this one. This one's really quite fascinating to me. This is a cultural belief found throughout Asia. The belief is that a fan left running in a closed room can kill the inhabitants in some fashion, usually through suffocation, poisoning, or hypothermia. There's all sorts of theories you'll hear about this, that it chops the air molecules in half and all sorts of things. Car air conditioners are also suspect, and sometimes you'll see in Asian countries, you'll see people in air-conditioned cars driving around with the windows slightly cracked. I have seen this personally in China and in Japan. Fan death is commonly reported in the news. And even some physicians attribute death to fans. They find somebody in the room and they died. Oh yeah, the fan was left on. Yeah, that's fan death, right? A very popular feature in the fan is a timer that turns off the unit after a set amount of time. So this is really quite fascinating as a cultural thing. And I think I have something I can show you, a little video of this. This still works. Let's see.
소리가 이어지면서 선풍기를 켜놓고 잠을 자다 숨지는 사고가 하루 2건이나 발생했습니다. 물놀이 사고도 잇따랐습니다. 이승재
You see in the back there's the fan. Down the guy in the apartment.
전북 전주시 교동의 한 주택에서 선풍기를 켜놓고 잠을 자던 28살 윤모 씨가 숨졌습니다. 또 어제 오전 9시 반쯤에 광주시 오치동 한 아파트에서도 74살 이모 씨가 선풍기를 켜놓고 잠을 자다 숨졌습니다. 경찰은 선풍기를 틀어놓고 잠을 자다 질식하거나 저체온증으로 숨진 것으로 보고 있습니다.
So again, you will see this. This is actually, people will attribute things to this. There's no scientific basis for this, by the way. Yes.
Could that perhaps have been prevalent before bad generators running fans were natural phase?
Probably what's going on here is that people are heating their houses with something, or cooling their house, heating the house with something that produces carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is odorless and colorless. You can have if it's winter time, you can have coal. You could have a kerosene heater. You could have something else going on. I don't know about hot when it's hot out, but likely these are some sort of carbon monoxide deaths.
That's what I was wondering.
And they don't have nothing to do with the fan. Now, you can do the experiment for yourself. I have done this. I've been giving this lecture for years and years and years. So I put a fan in my room. I turned it on, and I, did the, risked my life for you guys to determine that fan death is not a real thing. I'm still here. Fan did not kill me, and you can do this for yourself if you so like. There's no physiological evidence that fan death is a real thing. Just make sure you don't have carbon monoxide sources in your house running and causing problems. That carbon monoxide will kill you, fans will not.
I was just wondering if it was perhaps a misattribution.
Is what?
A misattribution.
Yes, I think absolutely. When these people die, there's a again, it's this human search for meaning. My grandfather died in his sleep last night. He was 92 years old. The fan was running. Oh, I don't want to just say he just died of natural causes. The fan did it. Damn fan, you find something to blame for it. So again, I think this is an interesting belief in that this is much more widespread than I originally thought. I was talking to my my sister-in-law, who is from Turkey. She's from Istanbul, and I was telling her about my lecture about fan death, and she goes, "Oh yeah," she goes, "Yeah, Turkish people totally believe that." She goes, "My parents totally believe that." And I go, "Really?" She goes, "Yeah, they live on the top floor of a building. It gets really hot in Turkey, like 120 degrees in the shade. It's really hot. And she said that they'll turn the air conditioning on, but they'll leave the windows open." because they're worried that the air conditioning is going to kill them. And she said that when they drive around in their car, they crack the windows with the air conditioning on because they're worried that the fan is going to, the air is going to kill them from the air conditioning. So again, this seems to be pretty widespread, at least from Asia and countries that adjoin Asia. So it'd be really interesting to see if we found this in other places. I'm sure you probably find this among Asian populations here in California. People probably believe this. But it's not true. It will not kill you.